Good morning, and welcome to today's Mayoral Forum, the only mayoral forum, in fact, focused on the future of public housing. And rightfully, I've been at more forums that we don't even exist. I don't know. And I think it's very important to bring this issue to the forefront. My name is David Jones, and I'm President and CEO of the Community Service Society. This is the second forum CSS has held where the candidates for mayor address the issues affecting low-income New Yorkers, working people. As part of our efforts to inform the public on where the candidates stand on these critical issues this election year, CSS will also produce and disseminate a voter guide and post answers to our candidate questionnaires online. And today we are also releasing our report, Good Place to Work, Hard Place to Live, the Housing Challenge for New York City's Next Mayor, that presents a detailed analysis of the state of the city's affordable housing resources and the public housing policy choices awaiting the next mayor. I want to thank our co-sponsors of tonight's forum, or today's forum, NALEO Education Fund, Community Voices Heard, okay, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality, good old Lower East Side, come on, the Legal Aid Society, New York City Alliance to Preserve Public Housing, Pratt Program for Sustainable Planning and Development, Tenants and Neighbors, come on, Urban Justice Center, United Neighborhood Houses, and United to End Homelessness. Before I ask Greg Floyd of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, City Employees Union, come on. They're our co-hosts. We've been working on this project for 6-7 months. To say a few words, let me tell you why we're having this forum. More than half the city's poor households are either public housing residents, hold NYCHA Section 8 vouchers, or is on one of NYCHA's waiting lists for public housing or vouchers. That's well over 500,000 New Yorkers united in their concern and anxiety about the future of affordable housing here in New York City. Over the past 2 decades, affordable housing for low-income families in the city has been drying up at an incredible rate. And now NYCHA and the current mayor want to transform this critical public housing resources by leasing NYCHA land to private developers to generate funds not forthcoming from any level of government, federal, state, or local. Sure, the current political and economic environment dictates that we pursue creative methods to generate funds to support and maintain public housing and address operating deficits and capital needs. But we also need to remember NYCHA's mission: to provide affordable housing to low-income New York households, and redevelopment has to be balanced with staying true to that mission. Today, the candidates will tell us where they stand on these issues, and they will do so before an audience and constituency of NYCHA residents, workers, their advocates, and concerned elected officials. We welcome them and look forward to hearing what they have to say on what is the most critical issue, I think, in the city of New York. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Greg Floyd of Teamsters Local 237.
I want to thank David Jones and the Community Service Society for partnering with Local 237 on this very important subject, mayoral forum for public housing. I think most of us here would agree that public housing is in a crisis. It went from a well-respected, shining example of civic responsibility that received national acclaim to a mismanaged, in-debt housing authority nightmare for both residents and workers. As president of Local 237, our 9,000 NYCHA workers, a third of which live in public housing, are on the front line of defense. They have almost an impossible task of repairing and maintaining developments without having the resources or effective plan to get their jobs done without a 2-year delay. Plus, if NYCHA's new secretive proposal to lease property to private developers comes to pass, there will be less NYCHA property to repair and maintain and no union jobs guaranteed by the developers. I was asked the other day, why do we need a mayoral forum on public housing? To me, it's a no-brainer. The plan for public housing by the next mayor will help shape the direction of public housing for generations to come. We know to make sure we want to make sure that the candidates know the problems. We want to find out what their thinking is. We want to make sure they're committed to public housing. We want to know how they plan to restore NYCHA. How will they help make NYCHA a resource of pride for residents and workers once again? One of these candidates will become the next mayor of our city. We need to know the answers to the questions. I now want to introduce to you a popular radio personality, WWRL's Mark Rowley, whose morning show airs 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday to Friday. Mark is taping this forum, which will be aired today at 3 p.m. and on Monday, when we will be once again discussing public housing with listeners starting at 6 a.m. Tune in to 1600 a.m. Mark?
Thank you so much, Greg, and good morning to everyone who has come together here. Before I go into my prepared remarks, Greg just said something that just really struck me. Somebody asked him why the need for a mayoral forum on public housing. Now, see, Greg is a nice guy, all right? I try to be a nice guy if I'm on the radio. But if somebody asked me that face to face, I would look at them and say, what are you, drunk? What do you mean, why? Ladies and gentlemen, the people that live in public housing in this city deserve a mayoral forum. You've earned this. Nobody's doing this, because you haven't earned it. You've earned the right to hear what people have to say about your future. I've said this a few times before, and I'm going to say it again today. In 1950, in this city, 2.692 million people voted for mayor. That is the highest number in the history of this city. 4 years ago, in 2009, 1.155 million people voted. With a population that's at least 750,000 people more than there were in 1950. Ladies and gentlemen, if you turn out to vote, you will influence the future of the places where you live. As Greg mentioned, I'm the host of the WWRL Morning Show, 6 to 9 a.m. And I deliberately talk about local issues that impact hard-working New Yorkers. I do that in part for the memory of my brother Clayton, who was a hard-working New Yorker, and the memory of my dad, who was a postal worker for 40 years. On July 4th this year, I will have been privileged to work in radio for 40 years. Us Rileys stick around on the job, I gotta tell you. Affordable housing, I don't have to tell you, is a gigantic issue in this city. 500,000 residents live in public housing. Sad to say, the entity that owns and manages public housing, the New York City Housing Authority, is in financial trouble. It's in financial trouble because it has slowly been strangled by the federal government, by state government, and by local government. So today, we hear from mayoral candidates, and they can do something about the local government part of it. They can stand on their bully pulpits to do something about the state and federal. Mike Bloomberg talks about guns. You ought to be talking about why the federal government doesn't commit more money to New York City public housing. Where are the funds coming from to maintain and preserve and to expand public housing? And not this whole lease it out to developers. I mean, really expand it for hardworking people in this town. Before I introduce our moderator, I have a message for NYCHA residents, and I'm glad to see so many of you here. And you're coming from across the 5 boroughs, which is a great thing. All right? Thank you for coming, and we hear you and your concerns. We know that you have questions and concerns. Staff have been making the rounds and have been listening to those concerns. We hope to cover most, if not all of it, during the discussion today. The candidates are going to hear from resident leaders and Local 237 workers who were selected in advance. That said, it is my distinct honor to introduce today's moderator. You know, having been around for a minute, I have had the pleasure of talking to and reading some of the great columnists in the history of this city. I'm talking about the Breslins, the Hamels, Murray Kempton, who once was in my studio. I thought I had gone to heaven. I put our moderator today in that same category. He was a tenant organizer in Brooklyn, which means he was a hardworking New Yorker, still is, but a hardworking New Yorker just like you. He embarked on a career in journalism that spanned 30 years. He's a former City Hall bureau chief for Newsday, former New York City bureau chief for the Washington Post, currently a columnist for the New York Times, where he writes about city government. The best tribute anyone can offer about our moderator, Michael Powell, is this: Rudy Giuliani hated his guts. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Michael Powell.
Hello. Well, first, I want to, just before we bring out our candidates, I want to recognize that we have a number of our electeds here. We have Councilwoman Rosie Mendez, Councilwoman Letitia James, New York Assemblyman Keith Wright, and on the way is Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez. If our candidates could come out now. Okay. I very much appreciate all of your coming here today, and as all the speakers have spoken about, public housing is part of the absolute. If we just have just a little silence, it's part of the absolute fabric, the essential fabric of the city. You have virtually the population of Boston or Washington, D.C. in our public houses. There are 179,000 apartments, and they are islands of affordability in a city that is obviously becoming more and more expensive, virtually by the day. They're in the, I guess, what is it, 1 out of every 12 rentals in the city is in public housing in 340 developments. And contrary to stereotypes, NYCHA families are by and large working families. Over half the households work, and of course many of the retirees worked before they got to a point where they could retire. NYCHA also has, as we know, all of us an exceptional history. It is the largest public housing program in the country, and it was long regarded as the best. You don't see public houses blown up here as you have in so many other cities, such as Chicago, Atlanta, Newark. Here they have held tight to the public housing, and it remains a vital resource. Yet, again, as our speakers have spoken about, we see clouds now on the horizon, right? Or not even on the horizon, they're gathering overhead. We have $60 million annual operating deficit at NYCHA, a $6 billion backlog in major capital improvements. And again, as was referenced by my friend, this is in part because the federal government, state government, and to some extent the local government has kind of walked away from public housing. Residents are the primary casualties of these policies because they're the ones living there. They're the ones that wait months and sometimes years for what most of us would think of as basic repairs. So with that preamble, I'm interested, and I guess we'll just start. We'll do this in the simplest possible way. We'll start here and we'll work down. And I'll give, say, 3 minutes. I would be interested in knowing what your vision is for the future of public housing. What, if anything, we can do to sustain the public housing communities, and how, assuming that we all sort of agree, and I take that as a sort of a given, that plays a vital role, how do you do it? How do you secure the operating capital money, and how do you essentially restore it to its one-time and long-time reputation as public housing that works? And first, former City Comptroller Bill Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Let me thank David Jones from CSS, Greg Floyd, the president of Teamsters, all of the sponsors of this morning's forum, and for all of you coming out this morning. Good morning, everybody. It is great to be here to have this discussion about the future of New York City, and NYCHA is part of the future of New York City. It is clear that the 600,000 residents of New York City Housing Authority have been treated as second-class citizens. They've been ignored. They've been pushed on the side. They've been made to believe as if they're invisible. I know that you are not. Future of New York City Housing Authority should be very different. We look at a system right now where the mayor and the housing authority have warehoused thousands of units all across the city of New York in the middle of the worst housing crisis that we've had. We need to be able to bring those units back online, take the $1 billion, $1 billion that is sat on the side, use it to repair those apartments and make other major repairs in the housing authority, bring those units back online and put those who need that housing desperately in them. We need to get rid of the current board structure. We need to get rid of it today. I believe it's important. Let's put a board in place, an 11-member board. You know something? 5 of those members should be housing authority residents from around the borough. Give the members of the housing authority a voice. Let's stop paying on the salaries to the board members. Let's have those other members. Yes, a chair who's the operational person that the mayor appoints. The other 5 members, let them have expertise in housing and management. Let them bring something to the table rather than just sit there and collect the salaries. We need to work a system out that does the repairs a lot faster, does them in local areas, making sure those repairs are done. They don't languish for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They get done right away so the residents don't have to put up with holes in the walls, leaks, things that don't work, broken appliances. We need to make sure we move those quickly. We don't need to sell our land for luxury housing. I was at Douglas Houses, and the people there are scared to death. If we're going to do anything with the land at any of our housing authority developments, let us use it for affordable housing, for middle, moderate income housing, workforce housing. Let's make sure we do that. Let's also, and I can see I'm running out of time, let us The housing authority, the people who live in the housing authority pay taxes too. Why we are charging them for police protection, why we are charging them for sanitation, I don't understand. What we need is a mayor who's going to stand up and fight for the people in the housing authority, who's going to work with mayors across the country to get additional money from the federal government. We need a mayor who's going to stand up and fight and make sure that the people of the housing authority are part of the future of New York City.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Former Councilman Sal Albanese.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Let me start by congratulating David Jones, the Community Service Society, and Local 237 and Greg Floyd for holding a forum on public housing, one of the most important services that the city offers and should sustain. I'm not accepting money from developers or lobbyists, by the way, which is unfortunate unfortunately, housing residents don't have lobbyists, and as a result, they're being neglected and ignored by state, city, and of course the federal level, which is an outrage. I want to follow some of the suggestions that have been made, follow up by saying that I think that we need to stop warehousing apartments. There are thousands of them. We need to put them back on the market and also clear up the backlog of repairs. It's outrageous that you have leaky roofs and doors that don't work, elevators that get stuck. There's benign neglect going on. There's no doubt about it, and that's very dangerous. And as I travel around the city and I speak to public housing tenants, they're very suspicious about what is the future of NYCHA. What is the city planning on doing with this benign neglect? In order to rebuild the trust, and I plan on doing that when I'm mayor, so we have to clear up those backlogs of repairs, stop warehousing those apartments, and provide the necessary services that people need. Hardworking people live in those complexes. They need services. For example, I opposed, when I was on the city council, the merger, the housing, transit, and police, because I said that it would lead to public housing residents being shortchanged in terms of police services. Sure enough, when I went to the Frederick Douglass houses the other night, what was the first thing that they said to me? They said, Mr. Albanese, we need vertical patrols. We need to be able to sleep at night. We need police officers that we know in our buildings. You know, $80 million is taken out of the NYCHA budget and distributed to other agencies in the city, and no services are being provided. So we need to do that as well. I've proposed hiring 300 more officers and assigning them to the Housing Bureau and establishing rapport between the housing tenants and the police, which is essential. That trust is essential. So, and I also agree with Bill's suggestion that the NYCHA board has to have representatives of the tenants on that board. And let's stop paying $190,000 a year to people who are basically political patronage hires. So, as mayor, I'm committed to making sure that we restore NYCHA to its former glory.
Thank you very much. Public Advocate Bill de Blasio.
Thank you. Let me thank Local 237 and CSS and all the sponsors, David Jones, Greg Floyd, for your tremendous leadership. I have to also say you've chosen with Michael Powell and Mark Riley, two of the real consciences we have in journalism in this city, so thank you for that. Why don't we start by talking about our current mayor for a moment? Let's talk about Michael Bloomberg. Now, Michael Bloomberg suddenly got interested in NYCHA recently because he realized when people look at his legacy, it will be clear he did nothing for NYCHA. It'll be clear he left NYCHA behind. Now, I've spent plenty of time fighting Michael Bloomberg. In fact, I led the opposition in the city council trying to stop him from changing the term limits law and getting that third term. And Tish James, thank you. Rosie Mendez, thank you for your leadership. So the mayor ignored 500,000 people for 12 years. And look, I spend a lot of time in NYCHA buildings. I talk to a lot of residents. I talk to a lot of resident leaders. NYCHA residents have been put through hell. It is not acceptable. The city of New York has consistently turned its back on 500,000 of our fellow residents. The federal government's worse. Let me be fair. The federal government started turning its back 30 years ago on public housing residents. But it is the job of the mayor not to accept that status quo. In this case, though, I have to indict the current administration further. You know, right now in New York City, I often say we're living a tale of two cities. Literally, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer before our eyes. And it's not acceptable. It's not sustainable. It will tear this city apart if it's not addressed. That's why forums like this are so important. This is what we have to be talking about in this city. What do? I agree, part of it is the next mayor has to be even more passionate about bringing resources to public housing and other affordable housing efforts and mass transit. I appreciate what the mayor did on gun control and immigration, climate change nationally. I wouldn't for a moment say those weren't good things. But the mayor's first responsibility, it's about economics. It's about bringing resources to our people. And he didn't challenge that status quo in Washington. The next mayor not only has to challenge it, has to lead the charge nationally and bring together mayors from all over the country to focus on that, our fair share from Washington. Now, right here in the city, let's be clear. We can talk about the horrible neglect. We can talk about the repairs that weren't made. My office as public advocate, the #1 complaint we get is repairs not made at NYCHA. We have been fighting now for years, case by case, development by development, to get those repairs made. But let's be clear. We're talking about developments in so many cases over 40 years old, over 50 years old, over 60 years old. For those that were in the areas hit by Sandy, they've been set back even more. So if we're going to address this, right, it's going to be changing the rules in Washington. Not just a little, changing the rules. Mayoral leadership that changes rules, in Albany as well. It's going to take not Bloomberg's version of development, because that's privatization. We won't do that. We will never accept anything that will undermine the current developments, that will undermine the right of tenants to be there. We're never going to accept anything that's a slippery slope to tearing down buildings, as Michael mentioned, happen elsewhere. What we can do is acknowledge that NYCHA doesn't just need $1 billion. NYCHA needs tens of billions of dollars to bring these buildings up to the quality levels people deserve. And anything, just finishing, anything we do to achieve that has to be with tenants and has to guarantee there will be hiring of tenants for any development that is done.
Okay, thank you. Comptroller John Liu.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for moderating. I also have to point out to my friend Mark Riley, I don't think Rudy Giuliani was that fond of you either, Mark. So I think we're all in good company here. A few weeks ago, I was talking with Greg Floyd, the head of our Teamsters 237, and we were talking about a lot of these issues that we're talking about publicly today. And he mentioned that there was this forum that was going to happen. So I do want to thank all of you for coming out on a Saturday morning. I mean, this is Saturday morning here, and we have hundreds of people. It shows how dedicated and commitment we all are to making sure that our NYCHA communities are successful and are given the resources and attention that they need to be successful. Thank you very much, David Jones, as well, for co-sponsoring and all the organizations that are a part of this. We are at a crisis level when it comes to public housing in New York City. 600,000 fellow New Yorkers who have been ignored by this administration for 12 years. 600,000 people, children, families, seniors, working men and women. And the NYCHA communities are in so many ways the bedrock communities of neighborhoods all across the city of New York. And yet, we always hear that, we don't have resources for this or that. Well, if we don't have resources, how can it be then, if NYCHA doesn't have resources, how can it be that NYCHA has to pay $200 million a year for city police and sanitation services that nobody else has to pay in the city of New York? If you live in a NYCHA building, you have to pay your share for police and sanitation services. Meanwhile, somebody could be living in a luxury high-rise across the street from you, and they don't have to pay any more. We all pay taxes, and yet the people across the street don't have to pay anymore. That doesn't make sense. If NYCHA doesn't have any money, why were they, last year, it was a big scandal. They were sitting on $42 million of funding that $42 million of funding that council member, our chairperson, Rosie Mendez, and many other members of the city council allocated for security cameras, and they did nothing with. And when my office took a closer look at it, we found that it wasn't just $42 million. Unfortunately, that was just the tip of the iceberg. They were sitting on $1 billion, that billion with a B, $1 billion of capital funding that should have, could have, and long time ago should have improved, fixed the elevators, the door locks, improved the lighting in the windows, fixed the boilers, so that NYCHA residents' quality of life could have been improved that much further. And yet now, they want to sell, as Bill Thompson said, they want to sell property on NYCHA to build luxury housing, this so-called infill, when they claim that they, are you sure that's 3 minutes? She's got to stop. I'll be very brief, okay? The infill idea is, once again, an idea of this Bloomberg administration to sell off public property that belongs to the people of this city, not developers, not high-rise, the people of this city. And once we sell that asset, we'll never be able to get it back. This is a bad idea.
Okay,
let's make sure NYCHA uses the resources that they have, not squander it, and make sure that we're not building additional high-rise and luxury development on the backs of working men and women in this city.
Thank you. I want to note, I was remiss in noting, Speaker Christine Quinn will be here. Will be here, please. She will be here. She will be here as well. The Community Service Society invited Adolfo Carrion, John Castamatidis, and Joseph Loda, all of whom respectfully declined the invitation. We also have, hold on. We also have in the audience, I want to recognize Councilwoman Melissa Mark Viverito and Councilman Robert Jackson. We're going to turn here to a question from the audience, but I'm going to just sort of cue it up here for a second. Several of you have already mentioned that NYCHA pays $100 million or more for city services that many other, most of the rest of New York does not have to pay for separately, such as $75 million for special police services and another $23 million for a payment in lieu of paying property taxes. And I wonder, I know that several of you have mentioned this, and I think the challenge is, at the same time, as you know, we have a very tough city budget that's going to be facing whichever one of you is the next mayor. What I would like now to turn to the audience member, Eric Crawford, who's a tenant association president at the Davidson houses in the South Bronx, to ask the question, but I would like to keep in mind that we're talking about finite resources, so how do you do it? And anyway, if Mr. Crawford would, see here? There we go. Hi.
Good morning. Once again, thank you for holding this forum, but more importantly, I want to thank the residents of public housing for being patient. We have been going through so much for so long, so I want to thank my colleagues and warriors for the patience that we're having with the elected officials that come before us and promise the world, and when they get in office, we see nothing. But we're going to hold you accountable to us But I want to ask, because you all alluded to the $70+ million. Yes, the Housing Authority pays for the fine cars, the police runs in their computer technology. Day one on the job, if any one of you are mayor, will you seize the $70+ million of public housing funding that's going to the NYPD? And second, what would y'all do to address the issue with the stop and frisk, where our young minority women and men are being stopped in public housing, harassed in public housing because they live there or they are there? What are we going to do to address those two issues on day one on the job? And I want to emphasize day one on the job as mayor. Thank you.
Okay. If we could, why don't we start in reverse order this time, Mr. Liu, and then we'll work our way down.
How much time do we have for this?
2 minutes on this. I know. I'm sorry.
All right. Very quickly, thank you very much for those two questions. Very important. I have long called for getting rid of this budget dance that happens every single year, where the mayor, in the springtime says, we don't have money for this or that, and then there's all these protests, and then finally, at the end of the day, a few months later, the mayor and the council speaker waltz in with this magical solution where almost all the cuts are forestalled. And this budget dance distracts. Not only does it take valuable resources from the budget process itself, but it distracts all of us from the real meat of the budget, which is a $70 billion annual budget. And in a $70 billion annual budget, when you analyze it from top to bottom, as I have, there's a lot of stuff in there that should be reprioritized. And when it comes to getting the it's not necessarily getting the $70 million back. It's not requiring NYCHA to pay the $70 million in the first place to the city of New York. And that's something that has to be reprioritized within our city budget. You look at deals where private corporations have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars from you, from the taxpayers, and yet they've squandered it. They have not created the jobs that they promised. We should stop giving them the corporate giveaways and give the money back to the people of this city, back to our NYCHA residents that never should have had to pay this unfair additional tax in the first place. And on the second question, before this young lady tells me my time is up again, on the question of stop and frisk, I think, number one, I think it doesn't work. All it does is it creates a huge division between the community and the police and makes it more difficult for the police to do their job. And when that happens, everybody is not more safe. People are less safe because of that. Furthermore, you know how much money and resource it takes to stop almost 700,000 people, almost all of whom have done nothing wrong? We could use strategies like focused deterrence. Focus the police resources on the bad guys. Not just assume everybody is bad and find out that actually almost everyone is decent. So we gotta focus the police resources on strategies like focused deterrence that have worked. Most of all, I just think it's dead wrong. I think it's dead wrong to humiliate our young men and sometimes women in the communities in the way that stop and frisk is out of control. Quite frankly, I'm honestly surprised that I am the only person running for mayor in this city in this year who is adamantly against the use of stop and frisk. On day one, we will no longer have stop and frisk.
Okay. Public Advocate de Blasio.
Thank you. Mr. Crawford, to the first question, absolutely. The $70 million was taken from NYCHA, I think wrongly now for years, but it was taken on the assumption that NYCHA was just awash in federal money, all this wonderful resources coming into NYCHA. And that hasn't been true for decades. So the $70 million being taken away from policing is unfair to NYCHA. It's another one of the reasons why NYCHA's put in the hole it's in. Now, I emphasize, you get that $70 million back, you get a lot of other smaller pieces back. We still have billions to go, and that has to be the work of the next mayor to incessantly find those billions to help NYCHA be what it needs to be, to bring it to the standard that residents deserve. But yes, in the beginning, I would direct my staff to take that $70 billion out of the NYCHA budget, not make NYCHA have to pay that. It's unfair to NYCHA. On the second question, stop and frisk. First of all, what's happened with stop and frisk has made the city less safe. It has torn community and police relations apart in so many neighborhoods. And look, as a parent, I have to say, what it does to the self-respect of our young people, particularly our young men, to be treated as suspects when in fact they are law-abiding citizens. It takes away everything parents do day in and day out, years of hard work to bring up the self-esteem of our children. What our teachers do to bring up the self-worth of our children gets torn down when their experience with a man or woman in uniform is being treated like they are part of the problem when in fact they're not. 90% of those stopped are innocent. There's real differences, though, among us here on how to achieve the changes we need. Now, I'm one of the candidates, and I know Speaker Quinn has chosen not to be with us yet, but I am one of the candidates, unlike Speaker Quinn. Unlike Speaker Quinn, I believe we need a new police commissioner. I don't think Ray Kelly will change this.
Mr. de Blasio.
And finally, I think we need a strong inspector general to make sure we don't have another stop and frisk crisis growing out of control, and we need profound reform and change in stop and frisk. But one clarification, John likes to say that he's the only one. I just disagree with that, John. When a police officer following constitutional guidelines appropriately stops someone following a suspect description, that's been part of policing, good policing, for a long time. That's what we want to get back to. What we want to end is discriminatory, unconstitutional overuse of stop and frisk.
Everybody being stopped and frisked is black or brown, even in white neighborhoods. Stop it. Some people call it stop, question, and frisk. There's no questioning going on. Bill, if you think Bill said that stop and frisk makes neighborhoods less safe, if that's true, let's work together to make neighborhoods more safe. Let's just get rid of stop and frisk.
Okay. I'll give you 10 seconds, and then I want to get to Mr.
John,
Albanese.
it sounds nice. It
Please,
sounds nice.
Please, quiet.
People need safety, and they need their constitutional rights and civil liberties. We need both. We owe our communities both. We end the use of stop and frisk the way it is now 100%. But you can't say, in a good policing approach, you can't say a police officer following the rules, respecting the community, can't ever follow a suspect description.
It may have worked 10 years.
Mr. Liu, please. Mr. Al, folks, if we want to be able to hear our panelists, right? Because there's a good chance that one of these people or one of the other arrival is going to be the next mayor, so we want to know where they stand. So let's just hear them out. Mr. Albanese.
Thank you. The first, in regards to the first question, the $70 million will stay with NYCHA. It will not be confiscated by the city for other services.
Please.
What I said is that the money will stay with NYCHA. It will not be used to pay other services. NYCHA should not have to, tenants should not have to pay that $70 million. I also want, as I said before, to hire 300 more additional officers and assign them to the Housing Bureau and make sure that they get to build a rapport with the tenants so that trust is built up between the police and the people who live in the public housing complex, which is essential to good crime fighting. It's essential, and I've gotten feedback from tenants that they want that kind of service. On stop and frisk, no one should be stopped in violation of the Constitution. We do live in the United States of America. The program has created tension between the community and the police, and I plan on amending it. There are 3 steps that I would take. First is intensive training of officers on what the proper approach, constitutional approach, for stopping and frisking someone is. The second thing is I want to hire 3,800 officers, assign them to patrol so we can have a community policing intake so that they develop a rapport with the police and the community, which is essential to good policing. And thirdly, I want to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana because it's responsible for a lot of the stops and frisks, and it's criminalizing thousands and thousands of kids, primarily kids of color, so that they're adversely impacted going forward in terms of their in terms of their jobs and what have you. So those are the 3 steps that I would take, which I think would make a big difference.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. Mr. Thompson?
Mr. Crawford, day one, the payments stop. Day one, you asked the question, should the payments stop on day one? The money being siphoned out of the Housing Authority and taken by the City of New York? Absolutely. This started back in 1994 by Rudy Giuliani, and it was a way, exactly, boo, it was a way to be able to siphon money from the federal government and give it to the city. Those days are gone. The money needs to stay with the New York City Housing Authority to better serve the tenants. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to stop and frisk, the use of stop and frisk so far, take a step back. We have had, if you look at 2011, almost 700,000 people, most of them young men, 90% of them, black and Hispanic, were stopped primarily because of who they were and what they looked like. There is something wrong with that. What we need to do, though, first, you know, if you've been watching the federal trial that's going on these days, it is clear that they're saying they've tied stop and frisk to quotas. That's wrong, and that's not the way it's supposed to be used. We need to start, and going back to 2009, I said it was time that we have a new police commissioner. A new police commissioner who doesn't believe in stopping everybody just because of who they are and what they look like. We need a new mayor and a new police commissioner who understand that it is not about just stopping individuals based on who they are, but based within those constitutional guidelines where there's a reasonable suspicion. It has poisoned the well when it comes to community policing. We need to stop that. We need to establish those ties of community policing. We need to tie the residents back closer again to the police department. So where you know that there are problems, you're not worried about reporting it. When you know there are problems, you know that your son and daughter aren't going to be stopped because they're doing the right thing. It's a question of those who we know at times who are not. So we need to tie the police department again better and closer. We need a new mayor and a new police commissioner who will accept responsibility and making sure everybody stays safe.
Thank you. If I could, I'd like to welcome Speaker Christine Quinn. And what we talked about is we started off talking about the sort of dire state of public housing in the city. The fact that it, houses population of Washington, D.C., essentially, and yet, has been cut for years on the federal, at the state, and the city level. What I'd like to do, if I could, is sort of combine for you, weave two questions together into one. One is, what is your vision? I mean, given that these very pressing financial problems exist for public housing within a context of a broader fiscal problems for the city as a whole. And then the question that came up here is, specifically, this was the second round we're on now, is the question of, that public housing pays $70 million a year for policing, it pays for sanitation, for water, a number of things that others don't. And interested, so if you wouldn't mind, try to get the two of those kind of woven together, and I'll give you 3 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you. And first I want to apologize for being late and thank Greg Floyd and David Jones and everyone at CSS and 237 for understanding that months ago I had made a commitment to participate in an event, an anti-bullying event with high schools across the city. So thank you for allowing me to come to this event late, since I had made that prior commitment and didn't want to back out on it. There is no question that NYCHA, on some level, has financial challenges, and everyone does right now. The thing we don't know is exactly what is the full extent or not of the Housing Authority's financial situation, because there are numerous examples of them being allocated money. In one case, $84 million in capital money from the City Council to put in cameras that they haven't used. There's other studies that show even much larger significant amounts of money on the table that NYCHA hasn't used. We need to get NYCHA to be managing its money better, spending the money it has, but there really is no reason why NYCHA tenants are the only New Yorkers who are paying the city for services that every other New Yorker gets because they are taxpayers. It's unfair for NYCHA residents' rents to have to go to the city of New York in this payment for services. There are no other tenants or New Yorkers who have to do that, so we have to put a stop to those payments so those funds can stay in the Housing Authority to help the Housing Authority have the funds it needs. But it's not just going to be about funding with the Housing Authority. We have to make significant overhauls in the management structure to make sure that funds are being spent efficiently, transparently, and we're not doing things like having a $5 million system to manage $5 million worth of supplies, for example.
If I could, just let me, and I'll give you one more minute because it occurs to me that I shortchanged Mr. Crawford as one of the tenant leaders. He had also asked, he had married two questions. One is the question of funding for paying for the police and this sort of thing, and also the question of stop and frisk within NYCHA. And he was asking if on day one you would commit, that is, the candidates would commit to addressing that.
I couldn't hear the end of what you said.
I'm sorry, to addressing the question of stop and frisk in public houses.
Well, I think on day one we need to address the question of stop, question, and frisk in public housing and everywhere in the city of New York. Though some of the places where it is certainly worst is in public housing. To get to over 700,000 stops in 1 year, and the vast majority of those stops not yielding guns or weapons or any contraband that was a danger to neighborhoods. When stops were at their all-time high, it was not having the same kind of decreasing effect in crime. Crime had been decreasing at a much more significant rate when stops were much lower. So there is absolutely no evidence that this level of stops is keeping our city safer, but there absolutely is clear evidence that this level of stops done in a way that is clearly not constitutional in this number and this volume, there clearly is evidence that it is ripping communities and the police apart. And that type of ripping apart absolutely makes it harder for us to keep our city safe, because the degree to which communities and the police are separated from each other, it is harder for the police to do their jobs well working with communities. So I would make it very clear to the next police commissioner, and I think Ray Kelly has done a good job, and I would like him to stay on as police commissioner. But I would make it very clear to Ray Kelly.
Folks, please, let's hear it. Let's hear everybody out.
But I would make it very clear to Ray Kelly that as mayor, he would work for me, and that would mean he would have to implement his job in a way that stop, question, and frisk were only done in a constitutionally sound context, and to make sure that was happening and other policies and practices were being reviewed, we would move forward with an inspector general in the Department of Investigation.
Thank you very much. For the next question, and again, I'm going to queue up a question from one of our heads of one of our tenant associations. NYCHA has proposed, as we know, raising needed revenue by making available public land and public housing communities for private development. This is what's, I guess, called the infill plan. The plan has aroused, very strong feelings, in part because it uses public open space for private development purposes to build mostly market rate housing. It has stirred opposition, as we know, from tenants and community leaders, some electeds and advocates, in part because of the speed and the secrecy with which NYCHA is moving forward on this plan. There's a lot of talk about trying to get NYCHA to slow down a bit and talk about this. I'm going to, at this point, ask Jonathan Gardenhire, the vice president from the Smith Houses Resident Association from the Lower East Side, to come and ask a question on this. I would like, as much as possible, again, to keep the conversation focused on, it's very easy to talk about things in public houses. Well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're not going to do this. Where's the money going to come from for whatever you talk about? But Mr. Gardenhire?
Hello, my name is Jonathan Gardenhire. I'm the Vice President of the Resident Association at Smith Houses, which is one of the developments targeted for private redevelopment under the infill plan. On behalf of the residents of Smith Houses, I want to express to you our extreme, absolute opposition to the infill plan, and I want you to understand, if you agree with me and you are from Smith Houses or any of the developments that are facing the infill plan, please stand so you understand the numbers of the people who are opposing. So please stand if you oppose. If you oppose,
Okay. Can we have the question?
yes. So beyond the fact that under HUD's notice regarding demolition and deposition of public housing, Section 10A, it states that lack of funding is not a valid reason for Section 18 disposition, which means that what NYCHA is doing is not legal, but since NYCHA has decided to steamroll over us and quickly move and secretly and quickly for residents not even to assess or comprehend their proposals, agree or disagree and have a real voice in shaping it, will you as the next mayor help to stop this steamroller of NYCHA, but also beyond that, since it's illegal, like I said, will you stop it?
Okay, thank you. What I would like to do is start with Bill, and we'll do 2 minutes each, okay? And go ahead.
Yes, I would stop it. I have come out and said, and you heard me in my opening comments, talk about being opposed to the mayor's plan for infill housing. I was at Douglas Houses a week and a half ago. The people out there are terrified. They have no information, no knowledge. They don't know what's going on, and it is wrong. To be able, back in the 1980s and 1990s, we had land in the city of New York. We had buildings, and we gave them away. If we had the chance to do it all over again, we would have kept those buildings and kept that land, and right now, working people, middle and moderate income people, poor people would be able to live in the city of New York and not be moved out and not be pushed out of their neighborhoods. What we need to do, we need to this should go through a ULURP process, number one. But that's not what we should be using this land for. We should not be using it for luxury housing. We should be using it for affordable housing, workforce housing, moderate and middle income housing, so that those who live in the city of New York could afford to stay here. We control the cost of land. We control the taxes there. We can push the cost of construction down. We can build, and it throws off revenue that could go into the housing authority to be able to maintain some of the other units. We don't have to go down the luxury housing path. We need to go down the affordable housing path in this regard. So, number one, I don't believe in trampling on the rights or trampling on the people who live within the New York City Housing Authority. I'm not going to ignore what they have to say. We should say no to this proposal and say now to it. And as mayor, I will unfold this. We should not do this.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese.
Let me just refer to the first questioner. He made a very good comment about elected officials and candidates coming forward at election time and saying whatever people want to hear. And what's important is who's contributing to your campaign. Follow the money. I have made, follow the money. Because rhetoric is just rhetoric. I'm the only candidate who's not accepting contributions from developers, because everywhere I go in the city, people are concerned, not only in public housing, but in neighborhoods across the city, that projects have been rammed through without community input building luxury condos, libraries are being sold off, hospitals are being sold off. So I want to make decisions on the merits. So when I get there, I'm not going to be handcuffed by the flood of money from developers in this city that are really loading down most of my opponents' campaigns. So follow the money. Second is, well, I am answering your question because it goes to your question, because developers want that land. What I'm saying to you is that I'm very skeptical of that plan. I'm skeptical because the tenants are not involved. I'm skeptical because who's deciding what's underused land? Is it the city? Is it the tenants? Is it the developers? Let's rebuild trust between the tenants and the city first. Let's clear up the backlog of repairs. Let's stop warehousing apartments. And then we can talk about those other issues.
Okay, Mr. de Blasio.
Mr. Gardenhire, I want to say point blank, I oppose the Bloomberg infill plan. I think it's dangerous, and I think it is part of what has become a final year of a third term that never should have happened to begin with. And allow me to be clear and say we have Speaker Quinn to thank for the Bloomberg third term. But in this final year, they are trying to privatize, contract out, get everything they can get their hands on. They're trying to close every school they can close. It's bankrupt. It must be stopped. Now, there has been an atmosphere of secrecy, as Michael characterized, I agree entirely. Secrecy and speed and ramming through, and we should never trust anything like that, but it is part of a more pervasive pattern, especially in the later Bloomberg years, of things being done without the people, but being done very much with the real estate industry. So let's be clear. There have been a pattern of giveaways to real estate, a lot of rezonings that were very sweet deals for real estate. Again, Speaker Quinn has offered a quote-unquote affordable housing plan that involves a series of additional tax breaks for the real estate industry. And Speaker Quinn is clearly the preferred candidate of the real estate industry. So if you are worried about a continuation of Bloomberg-era policies, well, you have to think about who's fought with Bloomberg before and who is going to fight for fundamental change in this city.
Mr. Liu.
I oppose the Bloomberg infill policy, and let's talk about why. Number one, the rationale behind it that the mayor puts forth is that we need money for NYCHA. Well, number one, NYCHA is sitting on some money that they should use to fix those elevators and door locks and windows and lighting. But $1 billion, yes. But number two, I think it's just, no matter how good any kind of plan sounds coming from City Hall nowadays, people just don't trust it. There's no believability, there's no credibility. And even if they said that they were trying to benefit NYCHA residents, solely benefit NYCHA residents, who the heck believes them? Nobody does. So there's no credibility whatsoever. After 12 years of doing absolutely nothing for our fellow New Yorkers who live in NYCHA communities, you think that we're going to believe you now that you want to do something for NYCHA residents? This young man asks the right question. Where do you get the money from? And Michael Powell's been trying to focus us on that. This is where we get the money from. We get the money from the companies that have already milked us dry in recent years. The amount of money that they want to raise by selling off this NYCHA property for private luxury development, we can get that money from other people. I'll give you just one example. In another real estate giveaway, the city gave this huge corporation, you might have heard of them, they're called Marriott. They've got this big hotel in Times Square. It's the highest grossing, most valuable hotel in the world. In the world. And yet, they gave them the sweetest deal since Manhattan was sold for 24 bucks. The Marriott Corporation, by the analysis of my office, we have poured through that contract. They have breached certain provisions of their contract. They have not upheld their responsibilities, which gives us an opening to reopen that contract itself. And we believe that the Marriott Corporation should pay us back $344.5 million. That's one place we should get the money from right away, instead of selling off assets that belong to the people that will never be able to get back.
It's time now. Speaker Quinn. Please, let's just hear everybody out, okay?
The plan to auction off Housing Authority property to the highest developer to build, in essence, luxury housing is a terrible idea. It is an idea that doesn't come from community input, that isn't going to help deal with the affordable housing crisis that exists in our city. It's an idea that if it moves forward, and as mayor, I would stop it, an idea that will make our affordable housing crisis worse. Now, let me just say a few words about what was said about my record and work on housing and the real estate industry. I will put my record of moving forward programs and plans that have generated affordable housing and permanent affordable housing up against anyone's. If you look at the time I've been leader of the Speaker of the City Council, we have passed more pro-tenant legislation than any council in history. We've been sued by the landlord lobby more than any city council in history. Right now, if you're being harassed by your landlord or by real estate interests, you can take your landlord to court for the first time ever because of the city council. Now that...
Folks, please, let's, wait a minute. Please, let's hear, folks, let's hear out the candidates. Folks. Okay, guys, please, let's just, ma'am, please, let's just give everybody, let's give every candidate the respect they deserve. We want to hear what they have to say about something, such a vital resource for the city, okay? Speaker Quinn?
Nobody spoke about that.
Are you finished? Okay.
What about Section 18?
Bill, do you have to leave? No, Bill wants to work. You do have to, I'm sorry, okay. Look, I have one last question along this before we move on to our next question. And I'd just be interested in a very quick response. I know everybody says it's very... Folks, come on, folks. Okay, it strikes me that... Okay, guys. Okay. Just give me one minute, okay? I know that it's everybody here has been against the mayor's plan on infill housing. Everyone, I think Mr. Thompson talked about, well, we should be doing low-income and affordable and middle-income housing on that property. Fine idea. That costs money. One of the reasons, for better or worse, that this plan was put forward is because NYCHA does have this very large structural deficit. I wonder, and again, I'm trying to kind of ground you back in the numbers. So if you make that perfectly good, public policy decision, we're not going to do market rate housing in there, what happens to how do you pay for that?
When you control what I said in my comments, when you control the cost of land, and you control the land, and you also control the taxes, and you can drive construction costs down, you can build housing, it generates revenue. That's what I'm pointing out. When you build moderate and middle income housing, it generates revenue. That revenue goes back into the system, goes back to pay for other housing within the housing authority. It's not free, but it's the same idea, it's a better idea. All you're doing with luxury housing, that generates the revenue from the land that you're leasing that goes back in. I'm generating housing that generates revenue that goes back into supporting the New York City Housing Authority. It's a different way to generate revenue. It's a better way to generate revenue,
Okay.
Michael.
I wonder, do any of the other candidates have a thought on that? They'd like to. Bill de Blasio.
Yeah, look, everyone in this room, I think it would be fair to say, is exceedingly skeptical about governmental promises. And I think for reasons of what you've seen with your own eyes, go way back to urban renewal in the 60s and 70s when land was cleared and then nothing was done with it. You can think of 1,000 examples. The only way this will work going forward is if government brings NYCHA residents into a process in a way that you can see and touch and feel and believe in, with real guarantees for NYCHA residents about, one, that there will be no privatization, there will be no units taken away from people, we're going to end the warehousing, we're going to create jobs for NYCHA residents locally, and that the money, any money created in any development process will actually go back to residents in the local area. Until you see all of that, you shouldn't accept any plan. Until you see a process that includes you, you shouldn't accept any plan.
Okay,
So Michael, just finishing. The point is, what I would say is, this Bloomberg plan is bankrupt at the start because he's not believable. We could have, I believe this, we could do a very different approach with the people, the grassroots, because there is a way to do some kind of development that brings money in for repairs and for jobs for NYCHA residents. That's the model I want to see if we can find, but it sure as hell is not the model that Bloomberg put forward.
Mr. Albanese?
I would agree with Bill's proposals. I think they do make sense. The other thing that we have to look at is the city doing enough to address the structural deficit? Is it prioritizing its budget the way that would benefit NYCHA instead of starving it? There's a huge amount of money that's contracted out by this city. Huge. And unfortunately, we've seen fraud in special education. We've seen city time, $750 million. So there is money out there, but we have to do this. We have to provide strong audits, do strong audits of these contracting out budgets, bring in-house some of the services. It would save city jobs and also save money, and we can use some of that money to provide decent services for NYCHA residents and address the structural deficit. The city has resources. We have to prioritize those resources, and affordable housing will be one of my top priorities.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. Do either of you want to weigh in on this? Or?
Yeah, let me
briefly, please. Just keep that comments.
There is a structural deficit at NYCHA, and that's something that we have to reprioritize within our city's budget. I've looked at the budget from top to bottom, as opposed to having this budget dance year to year that actually doesn't create much change from one year to year to the next year. And I've identified $15 billion over the next 4 years of needs in housing and education that need to be addressed, while also identifying an associated $15 billion of new revenues that the city can realize to pay for what people actually need in this city. And so that's a package that includes proposals for public housing in the city of New York. But again, I go back to this plan that the Bloomberg administration has put out there, what they call infill. There are so few details, but some of the details that are coming out are that, you know, you were talking about a plan that could create a revenue stream of $30 to $50 million a year. That's not going to address the structural deficit. It's, once again, giving away public property, public land to luxury developers, and still it's not going to solve the problems that we have with NYCHA.
Thank you, Mr. Liu.
So it's a false choice there.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Ms. Quinn?
You know, I think on the question of the structural deficit, it is true that if you, as Billy said, if you use the property well and build affordable housing, that's going to create revenue streams. Two, it's about making public housing a priority in the budget and making sure that the structural deficit is assisted by city funds, also by the city aggressively going to Washington to get the money Washington owes public housing, and lastly, making sure City Hall really monitors and stays on top of NYCHA and gets it to fix its finances so it isn't leaving any money anywhere on the table.
Thank you. Lagging repairs, as I'm sure many out here could attest, are a huge problem within for public housing tenants, and in a very large part of the negative, increasingly negative image that the public housing authority has at present. But inadequate funds, of course, are only part of the problem. We've also, thanks to a lot of good press reporting and also activism, we found that the NYCHA management has also had its problems. I wonder, as mayor, how you could see NYCHA addressing these repair problems and what you could do. And I'd like to turn this question over to Carl Giles from the, yes, Mr. Giles. He's a local 237 worker, and he'll flesh this out.
Good afternoon. My name is Carl Giles. I'm a proud member of Local 237, who has 9,000 members in NYCHA and over 3,000 members who actually live within NYCHA. I'm on the front line when it comes to dealing with the repairs at NYCHA and getting them completed in a cost-efficient manner. NYCHA has recently moved to centralizing NYCHA has recently moved to a centralized computer system for managing repairs that does not work. Wow. NYCHA cannot, excuse me for a minute, I'm a little nervous. I apologize.
Take your time. Take your time.
All right, NYCHA cannot account for available supplies and equipment. Residents are confronted with repair nightmares. We have our doubts whether a new Fix-It program will really deliver results. We want to get the job done, and we want to expand the workforce. As mayor, what would you do to see that the system is reformed and expansion of the workforce and that the work is done smoothly?
Okay, if I could, I'd like to start at this end, 1.5 minutes each, okay?
Mr. Giles, first, let me thank you for your question and thank you for your work on behalf of the New York City Housing Authority, as well as all the members of Local 237. Thank you so much. And by the way, I'm aware of the legislation in Albany. I believe Assemblyman Lenthal has introduced it that talks about increasing penalties for assaults on NYCHA workers. We need to pass that bill. We need to get it done. It is clear that too much money has been wasted, and this centralized system, I don't believe it works. When you have something as large as the New York City Housing Authority, we need to employ a more regional and local approach. That's what gets things done. So we should be working to create regional areas, and not just borough areas, but regional areas for repairs. That would speed repairs and speed the attention in each housing authority development. We should also, and we've seen it in the past, we should have more focus in contracting and doing business with local businesses and neighborhood-based businesses. That would speed development up also. Local plumbers, local electricians working along with you in some instances, some that work for the city of New York right now. We need to make sure, and maybe not in electricians and plumbers, but in other local services, we need to employ a regional and local approach. I think it makes sense to grow and increase where we can, the number of local or the number of NYCHA workers to be able to do repair where the money is there. So it's a combination of a regional approach, not a big centralized approach. That never works. A regional approach tied to some local additional services, tied to some additional workers to be able to speed repairs. That works for the system.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Albanese?
I've spoken to a number of retired supervisors from NYCHA, and they've all told me unequivocally that the computer system is a disaster. It's not addressing the needs of the residents. The repairs are going unmet, and obviously what else is going on is this administration is trying to privatize many of these jobs and not hire the appropriate people to make the repairs, the maintenance staff, They want to it's part of a movement, in my opinion, to drive down wages and benefits and really hurt the labor movement in the city. And that's what's driving part of this. And it's clear we need to hire more people. It's clear we need a regional approach with accountability. We have one that worked before. If it's not broken, why fix it? All of a sudden, all of these new ideas are being brought in, and I'm not against innovation, but the fact of the matter is, as Mr. Giles pointed out and others, it's not working. Let's hire the proper staff. Let's hire the maintenance people and make sure that they're paid decent wages, living wages and benefits, so that they're happy going to work and doing the job that they need to do for the NYCHA tenants.
Thank you, Mr. Albanese. Mr. de Blasio?
Well, first, Michael Bloomberg didn't take responsibility for repairs at NYCHA, and then John Rhea didn't take responsibility for repairs at NYCHA, and then the NYCHA board didn't take responsibility, and the blunt reality is they all have to go. We need an entirely different approach. So we need the structural reform, but let me just tell you how pitiful this is, and so many people in this room are living it. Again, the number one type of complaint we get at the Office of Public Advocate is NYCHA repairs. Health and safety repairs. Things that affect people's lives very deeply. And we have fought, and finally we got some of those done. Year in, year out, we'd fight and fight NYCHA to get some of them done. We got some of them done. I sat down with Rhea and all of his senior management, and they admitted to me last year they had no plan for making sure that health and safety repairs would be made first. That is pitiful. It's not acceptable, and yet, with our great manager, businessman, mayor, this was everyday life for the last 12 years. This new plan that they're going to get rid of all the backlog, you know, don't take any wooden nickels, I say. It's not going to happen. So what we need to do is, and by the way, I fought against the computer system too, the NICE system. This is one of my favorite ones, the NICE system that left tons of Section 8 holders and NYCHA residents out in the cold and almost led to people being evicted. Don't forget that one. We fought against that. But the bottom line is a repair system that when you hear there is a health or safety problem, when there's mold, when there are doors that don't lock, when there's vermin, when there's anything particularly that would affect the health and safety of families and children, that goes to the top of the list, and that is right now. That is the kind of managerial system we need, and I've talked to Greg Floyd about this many times. The workers at NYCHA are ready to do the work. They need a management system that helps them do the work.
Mr. Watt, thank you. Mr. Liu?
Thank you. It is just absurd when we hear stories constantly of people calling up for repairs, and they get an appointment. You know, today is April 20th, and they get an appointment for September 20th. September 20th of 2015. I mean, these are the kinds of stories that we're hearing, and the repairs and the delays and the absolute absence of real appointments is a shocking story that has to be told in the city of New York. What's even more shocking is that Bill is right. There are employees, there are workers in the NYCHA community ready, willing, and able to do the work. Whether they are already members of Local 237, or whether they are looking for work, and under the federal guidelines, they're supposed to be hiring more local residents to do these jobs. Instead, where is the money going to? It's going to another one of these Mike Bloomberg specialties. Computerize everything. You know how much money they wasted in computerizing city time? $500 million wasted that was finally, fortunately, ultimately recovered for the city of New York. Today we learned that another system has failed almost 3,000 kids because they graded their tests in the schools wrongly. And now parents have to go through a nightmare of reapplying for those programs. Well, the amount of money that they have spent on this computerization system, they should have just spent the money in the first place where it actually works. Okay. Hire the workers, pay the employees to do the work to actually get the repairs fixed, as opposed to fixing up this computerization system.
Thank you. Speaker Quinn.
This situation before the computer system was unacceptable in the backlog, and the computer system, which was promised to fix it, has not made it any better. It has made it worse. And the truth is, we have hardworking men and women who are ready every day to go out and help make NYCHA homes, improve the problems, fix them, make them livable. And the management at NYCHA and this computer system is just another example of it, is standing in the way of making that happen. That's one of the reasons last year in the council, we allocated more money to NYCHA, to hire NYCHA residents to become 237 members who could help take the backlog down and begin to do maintenance. We need to do more of that, but we also need to get a system that really, on a local basis, can track where the work orders are, and that should be transparent. Every work order in any building, where it's at, when it came in, has it been fixed, should be on the internet so everyone in the city of New York, NYCHA resident or not, can see where things are at, so we can build even more voices and even more pressure to get these repairs done on a timely manner. People are paying their rent. They deserve to have a home they can live in. This system has just, quite frankly, made things work and is failing the tenants.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Thompson, you have to...
Yep, Michael, and let me apologize to the audience. I had mentioned to Michael at the beginning, which is why before the last question, he had asked if I had to go. I have another appointment I have to run to, another appointment. I wanted to make sure I was here, and I was here early early today. Look, as I leave, and my apologies in not staying for our final question, but this is a year of decision in New York City. This is a year where the people, that sleeping giant as it's been referred to, the people in the New York City Housing Authority have the power to determine the future of the city. Power is in your hands this year. You determine who the next mayor is. You've heard a number of the proposals tonight in discussions. This is about not just the future of the city of New York, this is about your future. This is about your future. Thank you all so much.
Okay, I'd like to recognize two more of our elected New York City Councilwoman Gail Brewer and New York State Senator Velma Montgomery are here. One of the questions, and in fact, you were all touching on this a bit in the last question that's come up, is that the Housing Act of 1968 requires that housing authorities use HUD to the maximum extent possible to create jobs and training for residents. And NYCHA's record in this way is, I think, spotty over the many years, as well as other city agencies. And I wonder whether it's the mayor's infill program or, as a number of you've described it, another version of it that would be, that would have quite a bit more affordable housing. How do you work to ensure that there's both job training and permanent jobs that are created out of that? But don't just answer me. We're going to have Bernard Williams, who's a local 237 member, come up and ask this question.
How you doing, candidates? Good afternoon. My name is Bernard Williams. I'm an employee of New York City Housing Authority and a member of Local 237 for 28 years. Our concerns about the infill program, how will it impact our jobs? Privatization usually results in a reduction of private sector jobs. For example, fewer parking or recreation areas owned by NYCHA means fewer jobs for us. The same goes for residents. Since HUD money and private development, since the HUD money is given, private developers are not required to offer jobs and training opportunities. As mayor, what's your plan to help ensure the municipal workers union and the residents don't lose their jobs in the future? Also, you know that NYCHA, not only NYCHA, but the city of New York and our country is built on union labor. It's successful. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, what I'd like to do is start at the far end. Ms. Quinn?
The present, you're absolutely right, sir. The present infill plan has no expectation at all of union workers, which is another problem with the infill plan. There will be no requirement, guarantee of 237 or any NYCHA residents if we all fail and don't stop that plan. So whatever we do moving forward, if there is future development on any of these properties or other properties, we have to move forward in a way to make sure the workers who work there are part of the great unionized workforce that has been the only real thing in NYCHA that has been working for tenants, and that is another problem with this plan and another reason why we should stop it in its tracks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Liu?
Thank you very much. The mandate has just simply been ignored by this administration. There is a mandate that comes in the federal rules that require the employment, the recruitment and hiring of local NYCHA residents for these jobs. And yet we have seen very little action on the part of this administration. We have seen, but like it does in pretty much every other city agency, instead of going to people who are vested in what's happening, particularly NYCHA residents, they go outside and they hire consultants to come in, or they they contract outside for the work to be done. We have people who need the work, who want to work, and who are committed to NYCHA's success. Not these outsiders that keep getting pulled in these very expensive contracts that cost taxpayers much more money than if they hired the local residents in the first place. So under my administration, you would see the local residents being hired. You would see a vast reduction in these expensive outside consultants that keep being brought in from the outside. That is the new patronage system under this administration, outside consultants. What we need to do is put the jobs back in the hands of New Yorkers and local residents.
Okay, thank you. Mr. de Blasio?
Incredibly shameful reality in this city has been the way the city of New York under Michael Bloomberg has ignored Section 3, the federal law that says hire local residents, hire NYCHA residents for NYCHA work. It's been ignored. That law has been openly ignored. Now, you'll also hear people in the real estate industry tell you how, well, they can never agree to local hiring because it's not something they're legally allowed to do in the land use process. That is bull. There are plenty of ways to guarantee a new approach in this city that says you hire local residents first, especially in areas of need, because that's how you start to change a status quo that's not acceptable in this city. That's how you start to address the income disparity and the unemployment that pervades so many of our neighborhoods. As mayor, I would order NYCHA to do everything it can, and it has a lot of power, and it has a lot of resources, to hire local residents in the repairs we do, in the capital work we do, in any development we do in the future with the community. Hire local people first. Now, the workforce of 237, which works long and hard, and which worked heroically after Sandy, in developments, by the way, incredible work after Sandy, in developments housing 80,000 people that were hit so hard, and if it weren't for the 237 workers, people would have been hurting a lot more. We're going to need every single one of those workers, because if we're ever going to get that repair backlog addressed, we're going to need every hand on deck. So anyone who talks about cutting back 237 is someone who is willing to not repair the NYCHA units, and that's unacceptable to me. We need those repairs made, and we need them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Albanese?
I passed the city's first living wage law, which impacted 70,000 workers and put $3 billion in their pockets. And we paid many of them $12 an hour. Here we are, and that was in 1996. Here we are in 2013 debating a $9 an hour minimum wage, which goes to the very core of the question. There is a slow strangulation of the labor movement going on, which is responsible for elevating people and giving them decent wages and benefits. And what the Bloomberg administration has done, it's clear that they're anti-labor. It's clear they want to weaken labor unions. And part of the process is what they're doing in NYCHA. They don't want to hire local residents. They don't want any more members of 237. It's going on around the city. And as we see what's happening, not only in New York City, but across America, as the labor movement erodes in membership, So does the middle class, so does the working class. So this is a big fight here. It's bigger than NYCHA. I can tell you that under Albany's administration, I will be supporting labor unions. I will work with them closely because income inequality is one of the biggest problems in the city. It affects the ability to afford housing. It affects the ability of people staying in the city. And certainly under my administration, NYCHA will be mandated to hire NYCHA residents and members of 237 because they provide decent wages, decent benefits, and actually a decent retirement with a pension. That's what we should be striving for.
Thank you. The question of NYCHA governance, public housing governance, comes up a lot now. Many have criticized the present board structure. Many seem to agree that there's a need to have a resident commissioner. But the present governance bill, which just passed the state senate, puts the mayor in control, with all members serving at his or her pleasure. And I wonder, you know, as we go forward, do you favor mayoral control or retaining an independence? And what would your vision of sort of that NYCHA, you know, that NYCHA governing structure look like? 1 minute, and starting with Mr. Albanese.
I think Mayor Bloomberg has done a lousy job with mayoral control. Yes, he did. And I want to retain accountability. I would like to keep it to fix what Mayor Bloomberg has broken. So I'm not against mayoral control if it's done responsibly, because at least there's accountability built into the system. We know Mayor Bloomberg screwed things up when it comes to NYCHA. But we do have some accountability. What I will do is make sure that the New York City Housing Authority Board has tenant leaders on that board, people who actually live in those buildings and are able to provide decent input to the person who heads NYCHA, who, by the way, I will bring in a visionary, somebody who's a housing expert to run NYCHA, to make sure that it grows and prospers so that tenants have a decent quality of life going forward.
Mr. Blasio.
You know, this is another one of these very sad examples of the Bloomberg legacy that brought in Kathy Black to the Department of Education, and she was one of, I'm sorry, I used a curse word, I'm sorry. You know, one of 3 non-educator chancellors. Well, they bring John Rhea into NYCHA, a person who didn't do housing before. And it's not a surprise that if you bring people in to run agencies who haven't done that work before, it's not going to work out. So first, I want a NYCHA chair who has done work in public housing, who has actually made public housing work for the tenants. Second, I want tenant representation in every stage of the process, including on the central leadership board of NYCHA. Well, I'll tell you, I want mayoral control. I want the ball, because I think Bloomberg has hid behind the current board and acted like NYCHA wasn't his responsibility. I think he's used it to enable his irresponsibility towards NYCHA. I think it has to be 100% clear to the people of NYCHA and the people of the city, to every resident, the mayor has to put up or shut up. I welcome that responsibility.
Let's be very clear here. Mayor Bloomberg has had control of NYCHA. Everybody on the board has been appointed by Mayor Bloomberg. So the idea that, oh, it's not the mayor, it's this board that's running things at NYCHA, that's just a silly thought, because we know that's not true. So whoever runs City Hall has to take ownership of NYCHA, has to understand that he or she actually works for the people of New York City, including all 600,000 people who live in our NYCHA communities. And I am in full agreement that we need to take the input of NYCHA residents more carefully. We need to listen to the NYCHA Resident Association presidents and the leadership. We have to listen to the leadership, we have to listen to the members, we have to listen to the residents who live in the NYCHA buildings. It is this input that has been totally missing from this administration. So it's about appointing a chairman or a chairwoman and board members who have a background, who understand what NYCHA residents need and
Okay.
what public housing is about. It's also about an administration that is going to be listening to the people who actually live in our NYCHA communities.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Ms. Quinn?
Housing is, I think, one of the biggest crises we have in the city right now. And part of that crisis is what is happening at NYCHA. So we don't want the mayor to be able to say that I'm not in charge of that, I'm not in control of that. We want the buck, as it relates to NYCHA, to stop with the mayor at the mayor's desk. And we want and need the mayor to be held accountable. And when I'm mayor, we're going to bring NYCHA to a place where when you pay your rent, you get the home you deserve, where the apartments that are warehoused have tenants in them, to have a system that if seniors are in an apartment that's too big and they want to move to a smaller apartment, that they can, and a system and a board that is fueled with input from tenants, because the mayor and the NYCHA board work for the tenants of NYCHA to make NYCHA a wonderful, livable place, a great community that it has been and that it is, but we can't let the mayor walk away from that responsibility. It needs to be the mayor's responsibility. I started my career in New York as a housing and tenant organizer. I want to be the housing mayor, and I want to work with all of you to make NYCHA what it should be.
Would you put a resident on the board?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would put a resident on the board, and we need the head of NYCHA to be somebody with real, not just housing experience, but housing and public housing experience.
Okay, I want to thank. We're down to the end. What I'd like to do is take a minute and a half from each candidate. We'll start at the far end. What I would like everybody to do as much as possible, understanding you're running big complex campaign, is to try to keep your remarks focused on the concerns of the folks here. They came here to hear about public housing, your thoughts on how you finance it, how you pay for it at a time when we've got all kinds of union contracts open and everything. So if you just would, in closing, you got a minute and a half each, and just try to keep it focused again here on the concerns in this room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said, I started my career in New York City as a housing and tenant organizer, and I believe one of the biggest challenges we have right now in our city is a lack of affordable housing and the lack of quality, livable, affordable housing. And the situation at NYCHA is part of that problem. And we have lacked the kind of focus and attention that NYCHA needs. As mayor, I want to work with all of the residents of NYCHA and all the workers of NYCHA to bring NYCHA to what we know it can be. That's why last year in the budget we allocated additional funds, working with Local 237 to hire NYCHA residents, to become 237 members, to begin taking the backlog of work orders down. That's why I know if we put a real asset management system in place, we can stop wasting millions of dollars a year. I know we can put a real system in place where we can track transparently so everybody can see where they are, the work orders, so we can get the work done. Also, when I'm mayor, we're going to put a system in place, which we've already begun, to make sure that no dollar goes to NYCHA, whether it's from the state assembly, the state senate, the city council, or the federal government, gets unspent. It's disgraceful for a housing authority to tell tenants we don't have enough money to fix the hole in your ceiling when they're leaving money on the table from all types of sources. Together we can address these issues. Together we can make NYCHA as great as the residents who live there and the workers who work there. I want to thank you for your commitment to public housing. And just lastly, I want to thank Greg and all the men and women of 237 for your heroism post-Sandy. You worked around the clock. You never took no for an answer. You never told residents no. You just kept working. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Comptroller Blue.
Theyk you very much. As Comptroller, I'm very proud of the fact that we have uncovered and restored billions of dollars to the city's budget through uncovering wasteful spending by this administration and outright malfeasance by some of the corporations that have taken billions of dollars from us collectively. What we're going to do is the money problem is a real problem, and we're going to continue to find more sources of money that should have been invested and spent in the right places for the public good in the first place. That's something that I've been proud to have been able to do. And if you let me move across the street to City Hall, I'm sure there's more bodies to uncover over there. We're going to find more money so that we put the money back in the hands of the people of the city. It's also about, you know, we talk about NYCHA apartments and the repairs. It's a lot more than that also. NYCHA buildings form communities in the city of New York. And when I see these senior centers that have been undergoing renovation for 10 years, I mean, that is absolute ridiculous. It's negligence in the worst form. The youth centers that were opened up and then 2 years later closed down because of these. We've got to open those community centers once again because it's about building communities, making sure that they have the facilities and the resources, and ultimately creating a city of New York that has opportunities, equal employment, equal economic opportunities for everybody in the city. We've got to level the playing field. We can't allow an economy where the economic development policy is to let the rich become filthy rich and everybody else gets left behind. We've got to create the jobs, economic opportunities. Ultimately, that will make our communities, including all the NYCHA communities, stronger. Thank you for this great opportunity. Thank you.
Public Advocate Bill de Blasio.
Thank you, Michael. Well, first, I got to have a moment of truth here. You know, maybe 20 years ago, Speaker Quinn, you were a tenant organizer. But here in 2013, you are the real estate community's best friend. You are that industry's best friend in government, and you're their preferred candidate for mayor. So let's be real about that. What we need in NYCHA, we need new leadership. Leadership that respects the tenants and actually has worked in public housing for the betterment of tenants, and we need a brand new governance system, as we described, where the mayor actually takes responsibility. We need a mayor who's going to go get us those federal dollars. It will not happen overnight. Michael's right to keep saying where the money's coming from. It's going to take years of incessant work by the next mayor to change the deal in Washington, but it can be done. The Tea Party didn't used to exist. The rules of the game used to be different. We have to get it back to something that's fair to our city, starting with the residents of NYCHA in this city. We need not the Bloomberg infill plan. We need to say no to that across the board. We need to stop it dead in its tracks. Any development can only take place with, by, and for the tenants. That's the only way to do it. Finally, you need a respect for the fact that when there is a health or safety problem, when the city's biggest landlord, that is NYCHA, the one place where the most people live, in the NYCHA buildings, if our biggest landlord, controlled by the city of New York, cannot make health and safety repairs, not only in the same year when the problem comes up, how about getting them done the same month the problem comes up? That would be fair to residents when they're dealing with profound issues of health and safety. And I want a NYCHA leadership that does that and understands its obligation is to the tenants, and the tenants deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you. Former Councilman Sal Albanese.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the great job you did moderating. Mark Riley, thank you as well. And Greg Floyd and 237 for sponsoring this valuable forum, along with David Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for inviting me. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. You hear a lot of rhetoric up here about the ideas we're going to put into place to address the needs of NYCHA tenants. But the bottom line is that if you get elected indebted to special interests, none of these ideas will become reality. You can conduct polls and massage your message, figure out how to talk to different people and what have you. But what really matters is who's supporting you, who's donating to your campaign. I'm raising money and support from regular New Yorkers all over the city who are interested in honest government. I'm the only candidate with a record of independence. I lived independence. I don't only talk about it when I was a member of the city council. I'm the only candidate you can count on to put the interest of NYCHA tenants above party bosses, developers, and special interests. With your help and your support, we can build a better New York. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I want to thank the Community Service Society for putting this on such a vital topic. And I also want to thank the candidates, of course, for coming here and for giving us their time. And thank all of you.